Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is December 29th, 2018. It's just about over. For the final show of the year, on a special night for this show these days, a special guest. The View Up Here welcomes back attorney, activist, and agent of change, Stanley L. Cohen, for a 2018 year-end discussion about the year that was and the trajectory going forward into 2019. In what seems to be the norm now, old phrases have taken on new meaning and new purpose. Never before has caveat emptor had more impact, as it now seems the only rule is there are no rules. Hopefully, our discussion will focus on a few of these weaponized catchphrases, their historical meaning, and their new deployments. I'm not even going to bother reading the rest of the show page, because we'll do it as we go. Imagine that. All right, that's enough of the tune. Without further ado, The View Up Here welcomes back Stanley Cohen. Good evening, Stanley. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you, my friend. It's a pleasure to be back with you on this fabulous show, and especially the last night of what has been almost the last night of a beastly year that has been in many respects unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime. So many thanks for the opportunity to join you while you sit in the snow and I sit by the fireplace.
Well, I already broke one thing, what I said I was going to do pre-show, so just to get this in now, because I couldn't remember for 5 minutes what I said I would do. For those who are perhaps unfamiliar with Stanley Cohen, there are a couple websites you can go to. The one linked on his Twitter account, iStanleyCohen.org, I describe as more of a historical play-by-play of sorts of Stanley's career, his supporters, his detractors, but in the last little while regarding works of prose, journalism, reporting, opinion pieces, caged but undaunted.wordpress.com. Stanley, I think that Caged but Undaunted, has it been therapeutic, or has it been just something that you felt had to be done, or a combination?
Well, it's been a combination of both, but you know, as a young activist, I enjoyed very much, and I was full of myself when it came to my writing, and it was pretty shitty, I think, in retrospect. But I enjoyed it greatly, and then over the course of decades of litigation and having to learn how to write like lawyers do, which is anything but like a human being, I sort of lost the flair. But so Caged but Undaunted has been great and fun because I reunited with language skills that had been suppressed by screaming crazed judges, whether in the United States or overseas. And now in the last 6 months or so that I've gone back to a full-time practice of law, I find myself writing briefs and saying, I can't say that. Or the judge won't understand what I'm saying. I can't use a triple metaphor with a double negative to try to say, duh. But it's been therapeutic. I enjoy it. I like it, and I'm working on a piece now that hopefully will get published. I suspect it will.
Excellent news. It's good to hear that you are back immersed in the field of law. I'm sure. Was it as simple as just getting back in the saddle? That's it?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the first, I have a dear friend of mine who, old buddy from law school, who's a very high-profile and successful lawyer in a different field, said to me that he really pitied the first time I walked into a federal courtroom with a young federal prosecutor because they really were going to pay. But as it turns out, the first time I walked into a court proceeding was a state court proceeding with a ranking judge who I knew, and when I walked in, he smiled and waved, and then I fed on the prosecutor and won what I had to do. Some of the laws have changed. Am I a little rusty in speaking to juries? We're going to find out soon enough. I've got some potential trials coming up down the road. Got some things happening internationally that I'm working on. I've got actually a very interesting case that I'm working on the west coast of the United States involving the cannabis industry. That, the clash between the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which says marijuana remains a Scheduled I drug and prohibited, and the growth, sale, distribution of it can be prosecuted, versus 30 states in the United States and several districts that say bullshit. So yeah. I'm about to challenge through a back door the arguments of the Supremacy Clause. So I'm back. It's okay. It's it's all right. Maybe stronger than ever. I don't know.
Well, that's just it, right? You got it. That's why it's a game. You have to play it. You don't get an answer without going through the process.
Yeah, no. I had a client that drove. I'm still up in the mountains. I'll be heading back to the city fairly soon on a full-time basis. I had a client who drove with a problem yesterday, 500 miles round trip to see me for an hour. So I said, there were a few other lawyers during that 500 or 250-mile drive. And he said, yeah, but none of them has beaten every case I've ever had. I said, well, that's true.
That's perfect. No, I mean, especially for someone with your life experience and your background of the inner workings, shall we call it, of the system in all sorts of different levels, I imagine that it doesn't matter how busy you get back in your legal practice, you definitely notice what's going on. And, I'm sure it takes up a certain amount of your energies processing this dumpster fire that most of the world is going through right now. I mean, you're the one who suggested the title, The Shelf Life of Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Now, did you see that as just an umbrella descriptor, or was there something specific, or do you see it as a program of many little things creating it?
I think it's probably a combination of all, and I think it's as much, the last few weeks. I have this practice of writing and researching and with a TV in the background, and normally I listen to Turner Classic Movies, the classics, and it's noise, but I get used to it. But lately I've been checking in every once in a while to see which one of Trump's family or friends has been indicted most recently, just so that I'll have a good smile for the day. But now that we've entered full on the 2020 election season, the thought of, here we go, full-time Kool-Aid is back and bigger than ever. I mean, look, we've always had, in the last, let's bring it on with Obama, the 8 years of Obama, who, came in with this huge storm and this smile and this charisma and this rhetorical flair and this ability to move mountains. And at the end of the day, he ended up a war criminal. He ended up building Prison America. He ended up establishing the surveillance state, but did it with charm and dignity and grace. And it triggered what I considered throughout the 8 years, and as you know, I called them I Have a Drone, and coined that phrase. This cult of personality sort of popped up because for the first time ever, left, right, in between, outside, inside, everyone felt comfortable with jumping out because she or he was good looking or handsome or charismatic or dynamic or knew how to carry a slogan in a certain way and learned the buzzwords and knew how to play the game. And the entire process that I had grown up in and around for decades as an activist and as an attorney, that required hands-on struggle and hands-on resistance and hands-on self-determination and building and community organizing and efforts basically broke down to chance. And whether it became, and look, in some of these chants and some of the people that have become, the cults of personality have accomplished some good things. And more than a few have accomplished nothing other than to learn how to stand in front of a mirror and to strike the band as the choir sings. But whether it's Assange now or whether it's been Sanders the last, 4 years or whatever it is, and now we've got, O'Rourke from Texas, and the new savior we have right now is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and we've got Trump, and we've got Putin, and we've just got this massive international cult of personality right now. I don't want to at this point, with too broad a brush, sweep into this reach Ms. Cortez, because she's young, she's new, and time will tell whether she's the real deal. But I came up with the title for this show, or we were talking about it, because it's just reached a point where we are all privy to observers, many of us participants, in slogan contests and very little else. Yeah. Right now, there is this incredible battle going on within the women's movement and the marches, which have been splendid, spectacular, powerful voices on the communities on many levels, is falling apart. Claims of anti-Semitism ripping it apart. Black Lives Matter gets a $100 million grant from, I think, the Ford Foundation, and becomes on some level a representative of neoliberal mainstream political bodies. But it looks good. So, we've entered a period where the skill set, the battles, the history, the activity, the activism that I came up in has changed. Meanwhile, the world has not, in many respects, and become more destructive. We've got battles going on worldwide that are being funded by corporate and government entities that people are not in the streets dealing with. Yes, recently we've seen some pushback in Yemen. I'm not at all convinced it wouldn't have happened but for Khashoggi being slaughtered by bin Salman. So I just think we've entered a period politically where pretty faces, good slogans, and choirs that don't leave their keyboards are unfortunately the wave of the future right now, and unfortunately the wave of the future.
Well, a little technology in the wrong operation can be rather limiting in one means, but never ending expansion in another means. I've done a few shows this year about the importance of data and how this entire shitstorm that we're in does not exist without the people participating in it. I mean, it's like a hurricane. You don't get the winds if you don't have the conditions. It just seems like it's a never-ending circle jerk game, but there are a few factors that have been around forever, as we discussed, and we'll discuss now, but they're being deployed in new ways, with new angles, with new mission statements, which aren't true because the old ones never were, but they sell. And one of those things is anticipatory obedience. And Timothy Snyder has helped place this phrase in the modern lexicon. History demonstrates the consequences of this trait of human nature. People just want to a certain extent, be controlled, an awful lot of them, on different levels. And the warnings of it at the end of every cycle this runs, but yet the natural return to it Is anticipatory obedience something that has to be engineered, or is it just triggered because it's human nature? Is there any way for people to avoid this enlistment in bullshit?
Look, there's always going to be a percentage of the body politic that wants to preach from on high and not leave their living room. And social platforms, social medias, the ability to transcend the narrow confines of border and anthem and oath through technology these days has been both a blessing and a bane. Obviously, the blessing is it's allowed us to build international movements, to support international movements, to expose international atrocities in ways never before done. The bane, the downside is it's really taking the wind on some level out of community organizing, out of people hitting the streets, out of community meetings, out of a history of resistance, although what we're seeing right now in France is perhaps the best of all possible worlds, where there's a marriage of the two, and that government may be toppled. But there is a tendency to believe in some circles that you can move worlds these days by getting petition drives signed off on, by doing GoFund efforts to subsidize alternative media, by screaming from your keyboard in ways that will be productive, in ways that will change the status quo ante, and it doesn't. Because the systemic problem that we have to look, I don't want to say it can't, it won't, it plays a role. It's a tool. It's one of many tools. But nothing ultimately substitutes for confronting the beast. Nothing substitutes for street activism. Nothing substitutes for face-to-face developing, organizing, and confrontation. I obviously spent, not as much, but still do, a lot of time on Twitter. I try to avoid extended debates, especially since, I love during the middle of a discussion with someone, them educating me about the history of American colonialism, about the corruption of the criminal justice system, about American militarism. Thanks, guys. It's like lecturing me. Someone lectured me today about Ashkenazi Jews that aren't indigenous, that they come from Poland, or they come from Russia, or they come from Brooklyn. Well, gee, thanks. Okay. I really think the issue is to be able to strike a balance between using platforms as an ability to spread words, to build momentum, and to get movements underway. But at the end of the day, you got to be in the streets. You got to confront the beast. You've got to, in the case of, for example, Israel, the BDS movement, nothing substitutes for hands-on, in-your-face, in-the-street activism. Look, the Kavanaugh nomination, where there was tremendous in-the-streets activism, where people were getting arrested, where people who were in the halls of Congress, failed. Not for want of effort, but it remained a victory, because it got people out there, it got people involved, it got people confronting people that are making decisions that affect their lives and will for generations to come. But there remains a certain choir that is perfectly content and happy to sit and to cherry pick the words and the lyrics that they wish to hear and they want to sing to, and that's it. And there's nothing unique about this particular generation in time. I posted something today that just to see the response, and interestingly enough, the response was from older women and men. But I reminded people that, without getting into debates about the role of national liberation movements and insurgencies, I posted about how years ago a generation took to the streets without a single leader who walked on water and shut the shit down and ended Vietnam. And it was an ugly time. It was an ugly period, and people were busted and went to prison for many years, and people were shot and killed. And it was a time throughout the world of confrontation and battle that accomplished much. It was very difficult and painful. Now, I'm not suggesting that necessarily is the answer to many of the problems that we have, but the reality of it is much of the world is in an explosive stage right now. When you take a look at events in Palestine, in Yemen, in Myanmar, and at the end of Syria, in parts of Africa, it's an explosive world, and the notion that we can sit around and debate angels in the head of a pin and wrap ourselves in old slogans and old debates over good versus bad, it may feel good, but it moves the dial very little at the end of the day. And we are at a crossroads. When you factor in the attack on our environment, when you factor in the attack on our health systems, when you factor in a changing world, we're in the midst of an unprecedented shitstorm. Now, I know every generation says that. I remember as a kid my father saying that. And here I am all these decades later saying the same thing. But there are certain things unfolding in front of us right now, which I think are generational shaping and will really impact whether we survive or not as a globe. You know, revolutions in the history of this world have typically not been directed or succeeded with more than 10 or 15 or 20% of the population involved one way or another. So I'm not looking to organize 90%. This is not electoral politics. This is not an electoral college. But this is the need to get beyond Kool-Aid, beyond the cheer that makes you feel good, beyond the look that makes you appear good. You know, we're back to the Bernie Sanders battle, except we've got, Gabbard now, and we've got O'Rourke, and we've got other saviors here. And, it's interesting because the West in particular has spent so many years searching for the right Kool-Aid, for the right savior. But typically, we have been mature and sophisticated enough in our politics and what it is we want and how we hope to get there to look beyond that face, that slogan, that voice, and understand that the future depends upon people and not anointed golden calves, which we seem to be surrounded by right now.
Absolutely. I mean, I accept that this sort of anticipatory obedience is a trait of human nature. I mean, you're just not going to get away from it. The thing that really puzzles me about it, though, is it seems that the more gung-ho, quicker buildup and reaction and demonstration force always comes from the side of the spectrum where we don't need it coming from. That's the thing that really disturbs me about it. We saw the phenomenon with Trump when he started these seemingly never-ending campaign rallies. Even when he's in office, he still has campaign rallies, but
yeah.
The numbers aren't huge, but for public political demonstration, it is different for America, for its history, the tone of it, the messaging of it, the negativity of it. And I just wanted to quote one thing that was in an opinion piece in the New York Times from David Brooks. And this is over a year old, this October 2017. And he said, "Today, partisanship for many people is not about which party has the better policy, as it was, say, in the days of Eisenhower and Kennedy. It's not even about which party has the better philosophy, as it was in the Reagan era. These days, partisanship is often totalistic. People use partisan identity to fill the void left when their other attachments wither away, be they religious, ethnic, communal, or familial." Is this new direction of obedience and Dunning-Kruger, is this a result of the breakdown of traditional, quote-unquote, American society?
To some degree, yes. To a larger degree, politically speaking, Trump has worked the room very well. We live in a country and in a culture and a time where the apprentice sells, but ultimately it is selling because of the browning of America. Racism remains the penultimate, all-consuming concern and fear, especially for the base of Donald Trump, which is largely unemployed or underemployed or to some degree working poor white women and men in communities that have exercised, they think, political power, but it really comes down to they have exercised supremacist presence. I think what we're seeing in the United States is this convergence of the worst possible storm, the combination of a showman who knows how to work the room, a huckster, a scammer, who's done it his entire life, with a flashback from 8 years of Obama, which has produced a tremendous blowback based upon racism, based upon the loss of supremacist self-vision. And I think what we see is ultimately the browning of America. If you're a North American Indian and you begin to talk about, the arrival of Europeans, the colonialized. It's an interesting issue to sit back and talk about how now there's a blowback because of the fear of browning of America, sort of a reversal. This manipulation of the wall and immigrants and refugees and Muslims, and what I consider to be a very directed attack on identity politics, quote unquote, by what I see to be, emerging National Socialism in Europe that's reached across the pond, as they say, as well. But I think the penultimate overwhelming concern in America right now is white women and men, in particular non-educated. And I don't mean educated in the sense of you don't need to go to college to be educated. But people who have refused to look at the big picture, people who have gone silently into the night, people who have accepted the status quo ante because they believed there was a certain benefit that they were weighed in and protected, are now seeing a country which is becoming increasingly brown, which is becoming increasingly Latino, which is becoming increasingly refugee, which is becoming increasingly from different backgrounds and cultures, and it scared the shit out of them because, for once, they had to come to grips with the fact that perhaps maybe one day the United States at long last might finally end up being, give us you're hungry, you're tired, you're poor, you're yearning huddle masses, or your masses yearning to be free. The melting pot that we've always taken credit for, but has really been a very small select group of white, largely older men and women controlling most of the public politics in our country. So there is this combination of a changing demographics in this country that has been worked and manipulated by the penultimate scammer, huckster of my generation, Donald Trump, and it's worked. It's worked for now. The interesting thing, and I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, is almost everyone expected Trump to lose. And I recall so vividly this debate about, okay, how is the far right, the armed far right, going to react to Donald Trump losing? And bingo, he won. And all of a sudden, the Charlottesville became the rule and not the exception. It is a very frightening time. And look, I've spent decades in war zones. I've spent decades involved in representing national liberation movements in Latin America and the Middle East and Africa and in the United States. I don't use the word frightening or alarming or dangerous lightly. But I believe that both in the United States and the Americas and in growing fascist movements in Europe and other parts of the world, these are very dangerous times. And what we're seeing is throughout the world, working class, unfortunately poor women, white women and men, working class women and men, white, rather than coming to grips with the beauty of diversity, rather than wrapping their arms around the prospect that sharing this notion of a culture and background and history, tradition with people of diverse backgrounds is healthy, is good, is productive, and in the long run will help people that have been alienated and isolated from the power equation to gain some real power. It's been manipulated and worked against them. That's the reason why there are sections of this country where no matter what Trump does, no matter how many new Trump universities, no matter how many new Trump foundations, no matter how many new Atlantic cities, no matter how many new scams, ripoffs, pillages, and plunders, they stand by him. They stand by him because he knows how to work the room. He's worked the room his entire life. And it produces a dangerous time right now, and the millennials are going to have to step up. Trump may only be there another year or two or whatever it's going to be, but the impact of his presence, along with the impact of other Trumps in Europe and in Latin America right now, and along with other Trumps in the Gulf states, means that we are going through a period that is going to direct generations to come in ways that are very frightening.
That all doesn't paint a very pleasant picture. But, I mean, it is there, and I think that's a whole nother part of it. I can see it. You can see it. I'm sure everybody listening can see it, but there's just so many that don't want to or just don't take time. But there's one other little part of Brooks' opinion piece that fits in really good, and I think when I read this, being not an American, I figured, wow, that's a really good way to put it. And he says, for years, the meritocratic establishments in both parties told an implicit myth. The heroes of the myth were educated, morally enlightened global citizens who went to competitive colleges, got invited to international organizations, and who have the brain power to run society, and who might just be a little better than other people by virtue of their achievements. But Donald Trump tells the opposite myth about how those meritocrats are actually clueless idiots and full of drivel, and how virtue, wisdom, and toughness is found in the regular people whom those folks look down upon. Trump supporters follow him because he gets his facts wrong, but he gets his myths right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, it reminds me of how post 9/11, how there was this explosion, pardon the use of that phrase, of support from throughout the United States from people who hate New York, hate what they see New Yorkers to be, hate everything about New York City, but suddenly adopted us as if we needed adoption. It was all going to be okay. And, you know, there's this notion that the base that stands and cheers for Trump, that these folks would ever have gotten past the front door of any of his buildings is laughable. I mean, people that stand by him as if he is a true working class hero, as if he is someone, a populist who is committed to representing their interests, as if he is someone who has committed himself to anything other than sitting around in Mar-a-Lago at night after this extraordinarily perverse tax cut and saying to his friends, I just made you billions of dollars. He read it. He read it well. He read it right. He didn't think he was going to win. He was positioning himself to, you know, to work it and to just for once finally make some money in his life instead of go bankrupt and instead of steal everything from everyone. But there is a base in this country that believes it. It's almost as if they were waiting for a new religion, one that was not built upon faith or blind faith, but was built upon the promise that they too could steal their way to a fortune one way or another.
I do see a lot of facts on the beach that support that, but, you know, when you think about it past the beach, look to the horizon, boy, that's a shitty situation.
Well, I got to tell you, it's funny. I hear it all the time from self-professed anti-imperialists and self-professed leftists, and I'm not going to, with broad brush, paint everyone, but I hear it all the time, and these are particularly white, educated, accomplished persons, that the fight is not here and now. The fight is confronting the systemic inequality, is destroying K Street and destroying Wall Street, and in the long run, 30, 40, 50, 80, 100 years, things will be better. I mean, that's a wonderful theory. It's a wonderful theory unless you're a person of color, unless you're poor, unless you're a political dissident, unless you have some health issues, unless you are a member of the LGBTQ community, unless you are a Muslim, and the isms are endless. So yes, I believe very much there is a need to confront the systemic inequality and the hatred and the power equation that dictates the future down the road. And I think that's a great enterprise. And Emma Goldman did that standing, organizing in New York City over 120 years ago. And Jack Reed did it. And every generation produces those visionaries who stand up and scream that it's all corrupt and it's all on fire and it's all collapsing. And at the end of their speech, they hit the streets and they work to make life more palatable and bearable and better for people that do not have a chance. And yes, there is a need to confront the beast. And yes, there is a need to rework the fabric of the society. And yes, there is a need to attack structural inequality in terms of the electoral process and in terms of the judicial process and in terms of the military-industrial complex and in terms of our environment. But there are hundreds of millions of women and men in the United States and Canada and 10 times as many throughout the world that are dying one way or another here and now and do not have the luxury of waiting for 3 generations down the road. Because what you do is, it's interesting. There's been this debate in the law about affirmative action being another form of benefit based upon class or religion or gender or identity. And the notion that we're just equal going forward will somehow one day mean equality is silliness. The notion of equality moving ahead means that the division and the advantage and the benefit and the edge that certain groups based upon race and religion and politics have will always remain that much further. And so while I get in battles in communities and on social platforms when people constantly say Trump is not the problem, he's just indicative or reflective of the problem, that's great. That's wonderful. But while you're working to topple the system, while you're working to rewrite the process, can we take on and topple the most corrupt, the most venal, the most racist, the most misogynist, the most ignorant administration in the history of the United States. When you take a look at what it has done just in the last few days alone, again, with regulatory changes, with executive orders that remove environmental protections, food protections, it goes on and on and on. We do not have the luxury of just saying the United States is going through a period where, okay, it's just the deep state continuing on. It's just the same old, same old. Well, it may be. And I'm not blaming just this administration alone. People who know me know I've taken this position for decades. I was no fan of Obama. I was no fan of Clinton. I was no fan of either Bush. I was no fan of Reagan. I can go all the way back to Carter. But this notion that we can somehow ignore the here and now, or to trivialize it, or to reduce it to just, it's just business as usual, it ain't business as usual. Just in the last year, the appointments of this administration of judges, whether it's to the Supreme Court, whether it's to circuit courts, whether it's district courts, will impact this country and thus the world for generations to come.
When you talk about the upper middle class, the bachelor degree white world saying that, it's a long road, et cetera, the way I see that is somebody who's halfway up the mountain, and they're looking up and they're saying, those guys on the top of the mountain are starting to get out of hand. We should start to do something about that. And they never look down into the valley. And that's where, 98% of the people are, in the goddamn valley. And from their position of privilege, which they don't really acknowledge anyway, they think they have time. But that's just it. And this is the thing I get about this obedience being drawn out of so many people to things that are counter to their well-being. There's just so many of them, and it just doesn't seem that there's any quick fix to enlightening all the them. What I guess I'm trying to say is it just simply human nature that so many of the species will not think in their best interests? That's just the way it is.
I have boundless faith, and I always have, going back a long time now, beginning before I was a lawyer and a human being, as a community activist, as someone who has spent, many decades in the streets, in the courts. I have a lot of faith in the ability of women and men to look beyond, to look up at that mountaintop that you were talking about. Lots of people, particularly in the world today, are struggling to survive. We have 70 million people that are refugees right now. We have tens of millions of people that are stateless. I hear all the time from people that, this is a relatively calm period of American interventionism. And I say, really? Those F-35s that are being used to slaughter people in Yemen, the 100 military bases that we don't even know about, or the hundreds of military bases that we don't know about that are all over the Middle East, that are in Africa, that are in parts of the world that are involved in fighting. There are lots of folks that are struggling just to survive the here and now. I do think that a predictable byproduct of the economic system, whether it's here or whether it's in other parts of the world, is so many people are locked into just trying to survive that they don't have the time, the wherewithal, the strength, or the ability to I'm not going to say to look beyond it, but for the women or men that are fortunate in parts of this world to have employment, to make ends meet, to struggle. It's an 80-hour week. Who knows? The United States, Trump likes to strut around, and Obama liked to strut around, and Clinton liked to strut around and rave on about the splendor of the United States. And the reality of it is, I don't know what percentage of the United States right now lives from paycheck to paycheck. And if that's what's going on here, imagine the horror going on throughout the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the 1% is at Mar-a-Lago paying $200,000 for New Year's Eve, but they are representing the working class all over the United States. They are making America great again. They are dealing with undoing all these environmental limitations and all these limitations on our food and on our health care that are really the problem. They've been told. So to answer your question, do I know if this is part of human nature? I have boundless faith, endless faith in the ability of human beings to fight the good fight, or to want to look beyond and above, especially, hopefully, with those who have children. I can't imagine anything more frightening right now than the billion people worldwide that are not making it, that have young children. And it's obvious that, in Gaza, in Palestine, in Yemen, in what was going on in Syria and still is a problem, in Myanmar, and a dozen other places in Africa, where people are burying their children every day. I mean, that's obviously heart-wrenching, and it's just overwhelming. The faces of these young women and these kids that are dying. And now, all of a sudden people are freaked out over, these two young Guatemalan children who wanted nothing but went with their parents, their mom, their father, family, friends, to get some peace and tranquility and stability in a future that end up dead as so much a vote for the White House. But imagine it's you have just hundreds of millions of kids worldwide that their parents are looking down and not knowing whether they're going to make it through to tomorrow. And it's 2020. We're talking about, this is not 1832 now. But the mere fact that you have administrations, you have leaders, you have political leaders, you have people on the ground that don't see the problem with our environment, that don't see the problem with our food, that don't see the problem with our health system, that see any discussion about that as dangerous, as revolutionary, as threatening to what? It's just, that's the mind-boggling part.
I agree 100%. And that brings us right into the next one, which John Pilger has been using lately to great effect, and that is Vichy journalism. And I mean, I imagine not everybody knows exactly where that name came from. It came from Vichy, France in World War II. Mm-hmm. But what was done there for the first time in relative worldview has been going on since that day. It happens in Turkey today. It happens in Egypt today. It happens in the Gulf region. And to a certain extent, by different methods, it's happening in North America. But it always used to be that outcast bandito governments would control journalism because that was the swing point between the population and the government. It used to be about political control, political messaging. It still is, but now there's a whole new part of this game. And again, it relates to data and targeting and how hard to push and when and what picture to use. This is now profit-driven. So now we have a systemic win-win with very clear winners and losers. Has Vichy journalism been turned on so much by the revenue of it that it'll never stop, even if a certain political goal is met? Is this just something that we're stuck with for the foreseeable future, in your opinion?
Well, you marry that to unprecedented attacks on independent journalists worldwide. There are more journalists that are imprisoned right now than we've ever seen before, everywhere. There are more journalists that have been murdered throughout the world than we've ever seen before. There are more journalists that, in the name of independence and freedom, play into this because people are so, I'm back to the choir. I hate getting back to the choir. But we've reached a point where the conspiracy theory journalism, where everything is a conspiracy, where every word, every image, every vision, everything that your instincts, that your experience, that your life tells me is up, is down. Governments have realized, whether it is the United States, whether it is countries in the Middle East, whether it is in Europe. I mean, you've had this recent, scandal in a series of countries where all of a sudden they're shocked. I mean, Der Spiegel, I think, is shocked over a number of their key journalists having been exposed, sitting around drinking beer and making shit up. But governments have very clearly understood the nexus between deflection and the media. And so you thus have, people call, on the one hand, you have the mainstream media, for lack of a better word, that, at one point you had how many dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of mom and pop outlets, beginning with street pamphleteers, running to small newspapers and television networks that have now, that then reduced to a handful of mainstream media, which occupies much of the body politic today. And then you've got what I call, the GoFund school of journalism, where talented people, smart people, political people, people that have a very sculpted view of the world have figured out, let me raise hell, let me scream some conspiracies, let me put out the fundraising, I'm going to make a bunch of money, and off we go. So you've got this combination of governments throughout the world understanding that the control of media protects them, keeps their back covered on the one hand, and on the other hand, you also have, in some quarters, the development of what is considered to be alternative media, that it's not enough to simply say government is bad, government is good, but creates a new counter-alternative, a new story, a new version, which is often bizarre. So you've got all this tension going on, and again, look, I hate to sound like an old man who's closer to the end than the beginning, but we get back to what I call the keyboard revolution. And it's interesting because we now see what's going on in Facebook, and we now know what's going on in Twitter, and we know what's going on when we see what's been going on forever with other social platforms, about the ability to manipulate, to massage, to control, to dictate so many issues that surround us every day. And yes, I think the use of the phrase Vichy journalism is apropos, but I also believe that same phrase is coming from some journalists who have their own agenda at hand. I don't see a lot of I.F. Stones today. I just, you take a look at, The Intercept, and I've had problems with Greenwald for a very long time, and The Intercept's got some talented writers and talented journalists. Who are they owned by? I mean, this is not a working class outlet. And I understand, for example, The Intercept's attack on mainstream media and being an alternative viewpoint. Who are they owned by? The Khashoggi. Look, the Khashoggi is another example. I'm convinced there will be a breaking news story in one outlet or another that he's actually, chained to a chair in Pizzagate with Elvis any day now. And that'll start, and the chant will break, and off it'll go, and we're off to the races. And it really is.
I was going to say that'll probably be on Bellingcat.
Yeah, I mean it's the test of time because I am a free speech purist. I do not listen. I let folks rave, let them rant. My view has always been the truth will always rise in the marketplace of ideas, and that it is when government has the ability to censor, to preempt, to control, to massage the content of the marketplace, we all pay for it. And it's not like the old days where you could jail a journalist or shut it down or intimidate them. The marketplace these days, and that's why this intention is increasingly limited by dollars on one hand and political power and extension on the other, and it creates a dilemma. So, lately this whole notion that attack on BDS, attack by universities on whether it's the Klan, whether it's the right, let them speak, let folks talk, let them put their stuff out there. The more we get, the more we can delve into it, the more we can resolve these questions, the more educated, informed, and determined we can become. But I think John is absolutely right that governments have to, if you take a look at what countries have either by economics, by assassination, by imprisonment, or by censorship have taken the lead in controlling media outlets, you're going to be able to figure out where we're at. Whether it is the United States, which has now dropped, one time the United States used to run around and puffing and huffing about its standing in the world in terms of journalist freedom, and we know where that's fallen now. The numbers of journalists that are imprisoned in Russia, the numbers of journalists that are assassinated, that are imprisoned in Egypt and KSA, the numbers of journalists that are imprisoned in Europe right now, the numbers of hate speech that's been, statutes that have been passed worldwide that now say, you can't say this, you can say that. Again, it's government reaching out in one way or another, controlling the body politic through access to information, deciding what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. Whenever I get in debates with people about hate speech, and I ask for a definition of it, and I push the envelope and say, give me your good words and your bad words, and who decides what's acceptable and who decides what's not acceptable? And is it the Vichy government, the journalists that serve that purpose? I think it's a difficult time, and I don't think it's by accident. And I also don't think it's by accident that the arrival of and it's interesting because, I'm working on an issue right now where in New York, I don't think New York has really thought it through. There's a bill that's pending in New York right now, which would require law enforcement to take a look at social media, so social platforms of applicants for gun licenses, and require that it become part of the process to determine whether or not, based upon what your speech is, what you've said, you are eligible for or can get a gun license. And on the one hand, I'm completely freaked out over this prospect, but I don't think New York State has thought it through. By using social platforms as part of a government process for the first time now, the First Amendment controls begin to kick in social platforms. The test has always been that private industry is not impacted by the First Amendment. The shopping centers were not impacted. They had the ability to say you can't demonstrate, you can't leaflet, you can't meet, you can't stand in the front of a store and scream, until the town square exception developed in the United States, where private industry, where private networks begin to serve a public function, it triggers First Amendment protection. And I don't think the legislators in New York have thought this through, because ultimately my position is I'd like nothing better than social platforms to end up to be governed at least by First Amendment jurisprudence, which says, no, you can't use your social platform to control the content of what's coming out there. You can't get the best of both worlds. You can't serve as a government function, a government purpose. You can't be the public announcement from the President of the United States or congressional representatives, or provide links that allow you to enlist in the military or to get benefits, but yet turn around and control the discussion, because at that point, First Amendment protection covers. Now, Canada's got a different situation. Canada's got a situation in which people constantly brag about your free speech protections until I remind them about hate speech in Canada, until I remind them about the anti-BDS legislation, which is antithetical to free speech. But then you go worse. You go to places in the world where journalists get chopped up in little pieces and murdered, or they get disappeared in prisons, whether it's in Egypt or whether it's in KSA or whether it's in Israel or whether it's now in Ramallah from the Palestinian Authority or whether it's in Yemen or whether it's in Africa. So, the Vichy government comments, it was a relatively limited period of time during World War II. But now with the ability of social platforms, with the ability of governments to come and go on the basis of social platforms, of course we're seeing a greater extension of government control, a greater effort by governments one way or another to control and dictate the message.
The other factor, I think, is completely 21st century in this issue, as John Pilger has pointed out so eloquently in his work lately. He goes after The Guardian. Because when the big WikiLeaks stuff first broke, The Guardian was one of the sources. The Guardian made a mountain of money running that material. And yet then years later, when it suits them, when they are coerced or given satisfactory terms or what have you, look at the hit piece they put out on Assange, which has been, pretty much completely debunked.
Yeah.
How does that make the institution of journalism look? And this is from one of the global beacons, supposedly. I mean, this is a level that, it wasn't possible with the global reach back in the 20th century. But I mean, can this be interpreted any way other than this is where the money is, we'll go with this, or that guy's out now, so now we'll do this? It just seems that it's like anything else corporate. Money is what matters.
It seems to me the last great heyday of The Guardian was when they did that 8,000-word feature on me in 2014. That was insightful. And, when they fly editors across the pond to come and spend 3 days interviewing me, I say, no, look, it is very clear. It is very clear. The recent, the revisit, the recent hit on Manafort and Assange And, I really am no fan, obviously, of either one, but I took a very simple position. I said, look, there's something called corroboration. There's something called evidence. There's something called facts. Somehow I doubt that Manafort went in to meet with Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in the absence of a videotape, in the absence of someone spotting it. So put up or shut up. I mean, the recent scandal over it shouldn't be called. It's interesting. For years, Trump's current base is the same base that's loved the Inquirer in the United States for years. You still see him in supermarkets where people stand there on the line and, John Dean had a baby with 3 horses and a dog last week. And, it's the same nonsense. And it really has come down to, I think you're right, and again, it is the 21st century because the ability of those traditional, those huge, highly respected international journals now have to compete with 1 million journalists, 1 million writers, 1 million researchers that have blogs and that can get online and can put up web pages. And they're fighting, and they're fighting to survive. I don't mean that in a sympathetic light, but it plays completely into the hand of conglomerate politics and conglomerate media control. So you have all at once, again, this tension between we're now at a point in time where there's alternative journalism, where there's alternative outlets. Look, you and I are doing this show. You're an extremely popular and powerful voice for what you do. 20 years ago, it wouldn't have happened. 10 years ago, maybe it was just beginning to happen. So now you take a look at, I recently got some feedback as part of the self-hating Jew rationale when I said, when I take a look at the New York Times op-ed board and the editorial board, there's enough Jews on that board right now to have a minion. And that basically spun out of their never-ending, blind, deadly support for Israel. But there is an economic factor, and I think The Guardian is a perfect example, and I think their Spiegel is going through that problem right now. You take a look at Haaretz, which is viewed as the leftist news outlet in Israel, and for every one little Gideon Levy story that comes out, there's 35 that are touting and puffing and beating themselves on the chest about how wonderful, enlightened, and liberal Israel is, no matter what the body count. So you're right. The Guardian is it the disease or is it the symptom? Where will we be in 10 or 15 or 20 years? I don't know. I mean, when you really go back in time, it all began with pamphleteers. And it evolved from street corner pamphleteers. And now we're back to street corner pamphleteers that never have to stand on the street corner.
Well, I was just going to say, wasn't that interesting? Because when you say we're back to pamphleteers, the first thing I thought of was the Federalist Papers.
That's right. That's right. I mean, Tom Paine literally stood on a street corner handing out, his treatise.
I'm not sure that's full circle. I think it's a square, but...
Well, no, I agree with you. You just never have, and it's funny because there are a series of bloggers that conservative bloggers that I'm always tweaking on social platforms. And I enjoy the ones that don't block me. Some of them just simply say, I'm not going to put up with Cohen shit. This is crazy. Goodbye. You're out of here. Again, I have great faith. My view is very simple. Censorship, when you silence words, you create violence. Censorship, prior restraint and censorship, no matter what it is the strongest ally that the status quo has. Powerful institutions and powerful governments and powerful movements and powerful people will try to control, direct, and sculpt the discourse and the debate. If you don't like what you hear, change the station, close the book, walk out of the room. The answer is not control the content. But when you talk about what's happened to The Guardian and when you talk about what's happened to other not just mainstream media, it's also happened. Look, I do not know what ultimately the evidence will or will not show about what relationship WikiLeaks played with Donald Trump. I don't know. But at the end of the day, and WikiLeaks has done some great stuff over the years. I've always said that. But at the end of the day, if it took off its publication hat and put on a political manipulator hat, and I don't know if that's what happened, we'll see, then it's done damage to speech. It's done damage to publication. It's done damage to journalism. Because once you cross, now everyone, look, every newspaper, every blogger, every journalist has a bent, no matter what it is. A candidate they like, a position they support, one they don't like, one they, there's a difference between being cantankerous and crossing the line to play the game. And I have no idea whether or to what extent WikiLeaks did that. I mean, at the end of the day, there may or may not be evidence to establish it. We'll have to see. Journalists, whether it's The Guardian, whether it's WikiLeaks, whether it's a blog post that Stanley Cohen writes, whether it's the New York Post, the Daily News, or the LA Times, if you're looking for journalist protection, you got to stay a journalist.
I agree. That is a big factor, that the definition of that word. And it's happened from international coverage level down to city council level. This is something that's been going on for a long time. And it seems that, if you want to stick to intent, then anybody who shows up with a digital voice recorder can be a journalist now. Anybody with a cell phone on the street can be a journalist now. That's fine, but what do you do when you have the people like the O'Keefes who get into this game? How does that improve anything? This just seems like an opportunity for some people who are good with tech and know how to pay money to get impact. They become driving instead of just an option. It's like when the Kardashians TV show becomes the most watched. It's not just top 10. It's the most watched. Is there any way to slow down that acceleration? Any decorum at all? Any moderation? Or is it just louder and flashier wins all the time now?
Well, again, I think that an informed public has to be more than listening to speaking points. An informed public has to be more than a slogan. An informed public has to expand their own horizon and view. And I ultimately remain convinced that the thirst for knowledge can produce information and truth. Now, on the other hand, there is a real problem because with the market control being consumed these days with social platforms in particular, whether there were 1,000 bots, 1,000,000 bots, whether it's Israel pushing the button, whether it's Russia pushing the button, whether it's the United States pushing the button, whether it's Facebook pushing the button, it's a difficult time with lots of poison flowing around, and you've got to be able to discern reality. And when you see, as we talked about in the beginning of the show, when you see the same image, the same picture, the same headline, the same voice, day in, day out, day in, day out, Sandy Hook lives with Elvis. I mean, you have to be able. Look, I get it. Not everyone has the luxury in this day and age of spending a lot of time doing research. Not everyone has the luxury this day and age of reflecting and engaged in colloquy and discourse and debate over particular issues. Corporate profiteers and social platform profiteers have picked up on it and made billions of dollars with fast headlines, with fast news, with repeating headlines, and running with it. InfoWars did not become a smash overnight because for any reason other than the fact that it picked up, that there was a yearning for people to have reinforced day in and day out the same frightful dogma that sells. I mean, Sean Hannity, when you think about the likes of a Sean Hannity being one of the most popular, quote, journalists, voices in this country, what does that say? When you look at Fox News now, I mean, the role, people that worked at Fox News that got fired for sexual harassment, that got fired for incompetence, that got fired for lying, for crafting stories, are now sitting all over the White House. We've got someone who's soon to be the ambassador to the United Nations coming out of Fox News. What's the alternative? What's the friction? The friction has to be alternative information, alternative sources. But how many of the alternative sources are crafting and sculpting and cutting corners and taking a look at what their public wants to hear and running with it? Like I said, there aren't a whole lot of I.F. Stones around these days. It's a tough call, but the answer is not more government control. I mean, the answer is not more censorship. The answer is not legislative. The answer is people pushing themselves to ask themselves hard and difficult questions. But even that is complicated in this day and age with so many people under the gun in so many places, it becomes more difficult. And then you have the issue of journalists who are afraid to speak the truth. of people that end up in prison for years, or people that have been killed for what they write or what they say or what they've investigated or what they've researched. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. There must have been 3,437,000 stories over white helmets in Syria. And I asked myself midway through why. And I understand, because it was an extension of the debate between the role that the West was playing and insinuating itself into and creating and fostering a particular bent in Syria. I understand that. But there's also a component of the public marketplace these days which pushes a particular sale that sells. You started out by talking about The Guardian, talking about big money. I mentioned, Intercept. Who owns it? Where's it going? It's difficult. When asked at a conference that I participated in 6 or 7 or 8 months ago, I'm not quite sure now, what the answer was. The only answer I could give was an informed body politic that's willing to work and not willing to be seduced by slogans. And that, my friend, that leads to something else that we talked about before, and that's this whole tension between, the baby boomers that are retiring, dying, and moving on, and the millennials. And, what they intend to do about this machinery of state, this machinery of publication, this machinery of politics. Does it come down to another run with 76-year-old Bernie Sanders, or is it now, Beto O'Rourke? I guess if he wears his IOF uniform and he carries an AR-15, and, who knows how far he can go. So millennials are going to have to make a real decision because it's their world. They're inheriting it, and they've got to make a decision about whether they are going to go silently into the night or whether they are going to play an active role in determining the future for themselves and their children.
Well, just to finish on that, while you were speaking of the way corporate infotainment functions, I just thought of it as what you're describing is information daycare, and it's very profitable.
No, it's funny because I don't want to mention particular outlets. I've been published essays, stories, commentaries, op-eds, and I don't know, a dozen and a half different outlets throughout the world. And, there have been several that loved the piece but tried to get me to massage an angle that I refused to massage and took my piece and said, thank you, goodbye. Now, the attempt to massage my piece may have been economic on their end, but it certainly was much political because of fear of blowback, and I understand that. Now, the real question is I'm not a journalist. I'm a guy who writes, and I'm an activist, and I played an active role. And I wondered on how many occasions other people that made a living in journalism and make a living in journalism or wish to move into that area, when confronted with that same request to massage, instead of taking their work and walking away, agreed and massaged. And if you massage, and I understand the economic realities, if you massage for, $1,000 on a piece, what are you going to massage for a $200,000 a year base salary?
Well, that is the very ever-present and modern angle to cooperation. We've seen, even in the last 10 years, we've seen what happened to people who gained a brand, who established a brand, but yet refused to dance through all the hoops. Think of people like Amber Lyon. They just simply disappear. It's, well, if you're not going to do what we want, we don't care how many fans you have. You can't speak for us. Goodbye.
Right.
Unfortunate. But, again, another spike on the belt, I guess is the way to put it. But you mentioned the changing of the generations, and this isn't just another change. This is the previous biggest generation ever, passing off to the now new biggest generation ever. And there's the quote of G.K. Chesterton of tradition is, in fact, the democracy of the dead. Now, what I wanted to ask you is at what point and in what processes, when we refuse to change the "we've always done it this way" line, at what point does that limit progress? Does it limit evolution? Does it limit a better tomorrow? And at what point is tradition being used to drown out logical advances? And the simple reason is to protect the status quo and the machine from giving up some of its power. Do we see that point happening now?
Yeah. I think that there is no doubt in my mind that every generation history tells me that every generation, especially the successful, for lack of a better word, and I hate that term because there's so many that are successful in what they do that don't get recognized, but every generation, every successful generation, every person who's been a player in their generation hangs on with absolute desperation to the very end because they're more convinced, and especially the closer you get to the end than the beginning, the more convinced you are of how right you are, because you can't look in the mirror and say to yourself, my God, did I just fuck up my entire life? Has this been a waste? So no, I have so many colleagues, contemporaries, friends who, look in the mirror and realize that to some level they've not only been betrayed, but they've played the role of betrayer. So, every generation has the buzzword, has the answer, knows what's best for that to follow. And yes, you have economic strangleholds that are maintained by the last vestige of the baby boomers. And you've got this next generation that is, breaking in and trying to make waves and trying to figure out who they are and what they want and where they're going and how. But the tension is there. It's funny. I understand that students owe $1 billion. I get that. I understand that. But it's relative. All students always owed $1 billion. When I started, I went to law school in 1980. I got accepted at Yale Law School, didn't go, and my God, the tuition then was, I think, $50,000. Now it's, who knows what the hell it is now. But I've had this discussion with millennials about, all right, you owe $1 billion. Next. It's a rite of passage. It comes with it. There are Rupert Murdochs hanging on into their 80s, their 90s, because they still run the show and want to run the show and control it and dictate it, and doing everything they can to ensure that the people that are coming up represent their vision and their view, because if they don't, then they have to acknowledge that their vision and view has been warped or failed. And my response to that in terms of millennials is there's nothing wrong with taking the success and the good and the principle from those that have come before, and at the same time dismissing, rejecting, and attacking the not good or the bad. It's learning your craft, it's learning your skill, it's taking control over your own destiny, your own future, your own life, and that of your children. And that requires a break. And we are at a clear break in history as far as I'm concerned right now on so many levels. And I think that's been a connecting factor for our show tonight, our discussion about journalism and media and independence and principle and where we're going. And now we've moved into millennials. So
no, I was just going to throw in, this is not a new phenomenon. As you said, this generational change has always happened through societies. It always will. But have we ever seen a big handover, as we're about to see in the next 10 or 12 years, where there have been so many legal safeguards and economic roadblocks, and has there ever been so many obstacles to prevent that transition than this time? Have we ever seen it rougher?
I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine what it was like. And again, I'm using the United States as an example, not because we're better or brighter or smarter or more productive or successful, but imagine what it must have been like to be a small-town newspaper, an abolitionist paper down south, if there was such a creature. I think every generation has had these enormous roadblocks, but I think you're right. I think the collective, the centralization of authority and power right now, in particular in the West, is unprecedented. And because it's unprecedented and because the tools of control are so dramatic and so dynamic and so costly right now, it poses challenges for the next generation that, you're right, didn't exist before. But I'll give you an example of how bizarre it's become. Bizarre is the wrong word. I have a buddy of mine who's a great lawyer out on the West Coast, a famous lawyer who we were talking to recently, and he had for years mentored lawyers. And he had this great office in San Francisco with 10, 12, 15 cubicles, and there were always young lawyers that were working there. And he's a great mentor. He's a great lawyer. And I recently learned that he had moved his office to a much smaller place, very different locale and venue, and I asked him why. And he said, because the young lawyers don't want to come anymore. They don't leave their homes. They do everything. They do everything in their cube, in their living room. And, process of law, of litigation, of representing people comes from working with mentors, working around people that have walked that walk. I remember for years, I can't tell you how many applications I would get from people leaving law school that said, geez, I'd love to come and work for your firm. I'd love to come to be with you. And, I don't care. Pay me $2 an hour and blah, 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 blah. And I would, I literally would get 20 to 25 applications a year. That no longer happens. And in the old days, I used to say, look, go out and go to legal aid, go to the public defender's office, spend 5 years learning your trade, fighting the fight. And if you still want to do it, then give me a call and we'll see where this goes. And it's not happening now. It was funny because that sort of mirrors this discussion I had with my pal out in San Francisco who said it's just changing. Now, if that's what's happening among progressive young lawyers, among people that for years we've counted on to challenge the state, to be friction on the machine, to represent people not because of money but because of a personal or political calling, what's happening across the board elsewhere?
That is a very important question, because if that is almost a philosophical change in an industry, what's it going to do to education in 20 years? What's it going to do to a lot of things? That is interesting. Well, I was going to say, this is the thing that I've noticed, just as me being born in the 60s until today. There used to be jokes back when I was school age about if you don't have money, you can't get very far. But now, being in my 50s, it's not a joke anymore. It's a reality in most things. It has become a determinant factor far beyond what it should be in a socialized world. But, it is what it is, and that's why I'm so kind of intrigued by the millennials, because they're the first ones to grow up within this general environment that we have now. They have had digital devices. They have had all the pressures of free debt and credit based on zip code, et cetera, et cetera. We both, I'm sure, agree that no matter what obstacles the machine puts up, people will find workarounds. That's why the machine has never won, and that'll continue. I'm just curious what the millennials are going to do to get around all this bullshit. And I'm kind of curious if it's going to be simply survival tools or redirectional tools, overthrowing tools, or is it just way too soon to tell? But with the pace of things, as we talked about this current American administration and those elsewhere around the world, Hungary, Philippines, Yemen, the Gulf states, Egypt, Sudan, South Africa to an extent, Australia. There's just so much bullshit going on. Is there going to be time for the millennials as a generation to implement survival techniques, or are they just going to go straight for it's time to really change things? Do you think there's any way to predict that?
Well, look, I have always looked at every generation as producing, no matter what the broader political environment, from within them come the best and the brightest. From within them stands a group that takes a look at who they are and decides what they want to be and where they want to go and does it. And it's funny, as someone who was an activist in the late 60s and certainly 70s and an organizer and then went to law school, it's funny how I would run across contemporaries, colleagues, friends that had walked away from it, that had gone to corporations, that had gone into corporate law, that had gone into different mainstream, IBM work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And always the discussion ended up being, I grew up. I realized one day where I was mistaken. And my response was always, I would have no problem if you looked at me and said I couldn't handle it. I didn't want to handle it. I didn't want to pay the price any longer. I didn't want to sacrifice. And this nonsense about growing up. And I don't think that's changed in any generation since. Look, the millennials are going to have a group of people that are going to surrender, go silently, be co-opted, sell out, decide to exploit whatever skills they have for their own betterment. And there's going to be a group that are going to stand up and fight. And whether as organizers, as physicians, as lawyers, as journalists, as doctors, as chefs, I think that's true with every generation. And yes, it's more difficult at this time for the many reasons that we've talked about. But for those that are willing to fight the fight, that go in with open eyes and understand it, they're going to continue to do it. And if they don't, then we're all screwed. Because if you have mass surrender from this life-shaping movement from boomers to X to millennials, if these folks surrender to it, then what's left for the generation that comes afterwards? And that's the $64,000 question, because it moves so quickly these days. The challenges are so dramatically different these days. The skill set, the benefits are so dramatically advanced, but at the end of the day, people still have to decide, what is it I want to be as a human being, as a person? What do I want to make out of my life? Am I a giver or am I a taker? Throughout history, every generation has confronted a powerful elite that has held on to power at a given point in time, and people that have confronted it have paid often with the ultimate sacrifice, their lives, their liberty, their reputation, have lived poorly. I was talking to a friend the other day. This whole debate about how Trump is now trying to remove Harriet Tubman's image from the $10 bill or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And, I was offended by Harriet Tubman being on the bill. I mean, she ended up dying in abject poverty in Rochester, New York, in upstate New York. This is what we do to our historical figures 100 years later, 150 years later, into pretty little dollar bills. Every generation produces women and men that will stand up, will be counted, will sacrifice, will struggle, will be friction under the machine. I hate the phrase, but will speak truth to power, and it's the march of time. The skill set is different, the challenges are different, the demands are different, but ultimately, if people are principled, if they're determined, if they figure out who they are and what they want to do and stick to it, we're going to produce another generations of movers and fighters and advocates. I'll give you another example that's of concern to me. Look, I've supported the ACLU forever, ever since the days of Skokie. The Klan and the Nazis marching in Skokie in a community of Holocaust survivors. What's of concern to me is every day I see a new test case, a new challenge, a new constitutional issue being litigated, and I see the ACLU. And that's great, and that's wonderful, and it's a powerful organization, and I'm glad, but I don't know where the mom-and-pop litigators are. I don't know where the Lynn Stewarts are. I don't know where the William Kunslers are. Someone said to me, I don't know where the Stanley Cohens are. I mean, what's frightening about that is in times of need, and this goes to the issue we're discussing right now, in times of need, even in an area where historically and traditionally there have been individuals who have stood up against the machine, we now have that resistance coming from a different kind of machine, albeit a well-intentioned one, albeit a committed one, and that's not how you fight this process. Because the next thing you know, you perhaps find yourself as the guardian trying to raise money for staff. And I'm not being critical of the ACLU. They've done some great work, and they're doing some great work. But this gets back to the question of what is to happen in a point and in a time, in a crossroad of history where there is so much at risk. Will individuals step up in small groups, collective, to fight the fight? Because if they don't, we end up with 5 big machines pillaging and plundering each other, and ultimately the little guy and the little gal being screwed over.
I think there's a lot of indication of different stages of those things going on. Are they more pronounced now? Yeah, I guess they are, but, I guess that's something else too. I mean, I've seen it through the course of my life. I'm pretty sure you would agree you have, and so should just about anybody else listening. Whether it's true or merely a perception, as you get older, things get faster. Old things, old processes, old change gets faster, and there's more angles, and there's more reasons to have your head on a swivel. Things never stay like they were, but yet what baffles me is in a lot of these so-called liberal democracies, we have so many people vying for power that insist on what things used to be. How can there be such wholesale denial of this reality? But that's the way it's sold? I mean, I don't get it. How does this get over?
Well, look, it's again, I hate to repeat what I said a short while ago. So many people, as they get older, become more dogmatic in their positions, in their politics, in their visions, in their view, because to do otherwise is to admit that you've failed or missed or dropped the ball as you've evolved. Mm-hmm. Flexibility is important, and core principles can never be challenged or sacrificed. But we do live in times, I'll tell you a funny story. I mean, I have a friend whenever I've got I'm not talking about my anonymous clients. I'm talking about everyday basic, how do I get from point A to point B on a computer issue? And I have to call a friend, a 25-year-old friend, and say, how do I get from here to here to here? And they laugh at me. And, I mean, that's new. Not that people laugh at me, but we've reached a point. But, again, as I said to someone, once the printing press, went a certain direction, went a certain way. But I do think, going back to where this particular segment started a while ago, that given this dramatic new generational change, and given the fact that the residual control remains in the hands of the end of the boomer generation, and they're holding on for dear life, and given the fact that the generation after them, the women and men that are in their 40s and 50s that have been schooled to basically perpetuate the status quo ante, they are coming up next. We are creating a standoff that if the millennials are going to want to move this and massage it, it's going to mean confrontation on a lot of levels. And I don't mean confrontation just over, political candidates or whether Kavanaugh gets appointed to the Supreme Court or not. I'm talking about fundamental and core confrontation. And I am optimistic on this level because I see increasingly across the country young women and men becoming involved in community council and city councils and taking to the streets and confronting, corporations. I mean, the battle that's going on right now over Amazon moving to New York City is empowering. I'm not suggesting they're going to end up losing, but the mere fact that there is a determined minority that is struggling and saying, no, not in our community, it's not good, it's not productive, it doesn't help us as a whole, what are we doing here? And it's interesting because it gets back to where I began, talking about the cult of personalities. And, you have this new generation, again, using the United States, not the best, the brightest, the smartest, the most experienced, but just in terms of that's where I am, that's what we're talking about, and we can expand it to North America without conceding any or suggesting any arrogance or any superiority. But, for example, I'm cautiously optimistic that with 100 new women or 100, I think it was 100 new congressional reps coming in, many of them women of color or Muslims or different backgrounds and backdrops and different politics, and certainly dramatically younger in age, that I begin to see some hope that I didn't see for quite a while. On the other hand, you still got a United States Senate that's controlled by 60 to 70 to 80-year-old white men. So these are difficult times. I mean, I'm watching right now, interesting, there is a growing resistance movement among what are called First Nations in Canada right now. North American Indians, tribes are beginning to step up and move. Some suggest, and I think that's selling the movement short, that it began with Standing Rock in the United States and moved up. I don't see it at all. I've seen it for decades. But, there's increasing movement and challenge and confrontation and expression of self-determination and independence that wasn't quiet, but it's started to explode now. And I'm optimistic in a strange sort of way that there are enough young women and men out there that are determined and are focused and are principled and will take the fight and pursue it, because if they don't, it's done. It's one thing to talk about climate change. It's one thing to talk about global melting. It's one thing to talk about what a shame that we're losing, 60% of the animals of the world will be gone. It's another thing to do something about it. And on that note, I remain optimistic. I do believe that there is a generation out there that understands this, that's committed to doing something about it, and will. The challenges are going to be more daunting than certainly they were in my life. In yours, because the centralization of authority and control and economic determination is so powerful now that it changes the nature of the resistance dramatically. And then, in the United States, well, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and the reach.
Oh,
the
yeah.
speed and the reach is the thing that's really changed. But when you speak about First Nations in Canada, it's been close to 2 decades now that the highest birth rate among identified racial groups has been Indigenous in Canada. Mm-hmm. And the thing I see with them is a very prevalent attitude of, we don't care what you used to do. Do you understand? We're going to do something new. Mm-hmm. And that's a mindset that has to be embraced. You know, it's not something you dip your toe in the pool. So, of course, I'd like to see more of that. But, yeah, I think you're right. It's just that we've seen little flashes of it over the last decade. If you go back to something like the Summer of Lulz and all the hacks mm-hmm. and the drops and everything else, the machine was not ready. And there are a lot mm-hmm. of other things existing that the machine is not ready for. But they have to be acted upon. And I guess that's the big unknown. Does that sound accurate?
Well, look, I find it so interesting that with this international attack on quote-unquote identity politics, and it's not by accident that the attack becomes more verbal and becomes more public and becomes more open as particular groups that have been marginalized, that have been distinguished, that have been discriminated against, that have been executed, that have been disappeared, begin to emerge, develop, and take power. All of a sudden, identity politics are bad. All of a sudden, building coalitions within your own communities, among your brothers and sisters, to obtain and express some self-determination, equality, and power and justice in ways that were traditionally denied you, all of a sudden becomes a problem. And I hear it all the time. I was at a discussion in New York City about a year ago where there was a speaker, and it really doesn't matter who it is, who came from the UK that went on a tear about identity politics. And I listened for the full 12-minute nonstop rave, and I said, spoken like a 45-year-old white man. Congratulations. It didn't go over too well with the audience that had come basically to cheer it on and support it. And then that gets back to what we were talking about before, and that's the browning of America. That is, we are now reaching a point where this supremacist stranglehold on the basis of race is dissipating, is disappearing, and you have this desperate reach by people that have always felt entitled but never received entitlement and have yet to understand it. And now they found a hero in a guy who wouldn't allow them to clean his bathroom. And, going back to your question, what, where, and how will the millennials deal with it? Well, it's up to them. I mean, it's a very seductive time because, there is a lot of money out there in the hands of a few. And, it's interesting. When I left law school 1,000 years ago, I had a choice of going to Wall Street. It's ridiculous for years ago, $100,000. In those days, huge money, working 80 hours a week, or going to legal aid for $17,000. There was no choice. I went to legal aid in a second. I would never go to Wall Street. But, today, the means of production, the means of distribution, the means of professional outreach and voice are controlled increasingly by the few. The market has locked up so much of the diversity and the opportunity that existed at one time, and it's made it more difficult and complicated. And it's more challenging. And the issue is, will people stand up to the challenge? Because if they don't stand up to the challenge, they will be the last generation to face the challenge.
That is a very serious and yet entirely likely statement right there. Now, when we talk about Kool-Aid and we talk about something that's become known as post-truth, there's one more thing I want to read from. This is an opinion piece that was in New York Times in April of this year by none other than Michael Hayden, who generally would not be seen as one of my favorite classes of individual. But
nor mine.
In 1994, during the height of the Bosnian Civil War, when I was head of intelligence for American forces in Europe, I walked through the ruined streets of Sarajevo, the city of once beautiful steeples, onion-shaped domes, and minarets, had been devastated by Serbian artillery in the hills rising above the city. I wondered what manner of a man could pick up a sniper rifle and shoot former neighbors lining up for water at a shuttered brewery. What struck me most, though, was not how Sarajevans were different from us, but how much they weren't. This had obviously been a cultured, tolerant, vibrant place that had been ripped asunder by the conflict putting Muslim Bosnians against Christian Serbs and Croats. The veneer of civilization, I concluded, was quite thin. Over the years, I learned that the traditions and institutions that protect us from living Hobbesian, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short lives are inherently fragile and demand careful tending. In America today, they are under serious stress. So this is a man who was the top spook. It was his stock in trade to create and study phenomenon like this. And yet now he's saying, holy shit, I see it happening here. Okay, this is really not good. But with somebody like Michael Hayden admitting that, it does explain a lot of the current situation, does it not?
Well, it does. And the meth dealer saying, oh, my God, I've strung out a generation of users. Look, I have nothing but absolute respect for whistleblowers. I also have very little faith in whistleblowers who begin to blow after they collect their pension. You know, lots of the alternative voice that's being echoed today is coming from people who spent their lives building and reinforcing the very process that they now want to expose. Is it guilt? Is it fear that, my God, I played a particular role for so long and it's now come back to bite myself on the ass, or my daughter or my grandson or daughter? But he's right. You get wrapped up into the power equation for so long, and it becomes outcome determinative. You know, you embrace a certain resolution, you know, a true believer of the worst kind, the worst sort, and everything is okay. And you miss the forest for the trees. And one day, the Haydens of the world, they look back and they say, oh, my God, what have I done? How can I change it, if at all? And does that not harken back to what we were talking about an hour ago, about people who are closer to the end than the beginning, having, you know, a new moment? I don't know. I think he's right in one. You know, it's interesting how we had that series of put aside, for lack of a better word. I don't know how you can put aside, I don't know, what are we up to, 380 mass murders or whatever it is, the figure is in the United States this year. Putting that aside, we had, it was amazing how we had that rush a few months ago where you had, and it doesn't matter whether it's Trump or whether it's, you know, one of the born-again Bundys now, who all of a sudden has become a progressive, having, you know, kicked the shit out of, brutalized and pillaged and plundered native lands for his entire life. You know, we're at this crossroad where, how long ago was it, where a Trump supporter sent pipe bombs to basically every major political opponent in the United States? And it lasted how long? It was swallowed by the next news bulletin the next day. And then a week later, another supporter locked and loaded and went out and slaughtered. You know, we had this notion that somehow we could be an island, somehow the pond across. You know, it's interesting because, you know, this whole argument about, you know, the wall and about the need to control who comes into this country and how or why, when obviously the danger is within the country, and the danger has always been within the country because the danger is the country itself. So for a guy like the former head of the CIA, the head spook of the country, to turn around and raise bells and whistles and alarm systems over what he saw in Sarajevo. And by the way, for, you know, the Kool-Aid fans out there, your guy Sanders had anti-war demonstrators over that arrested in his office years ago. And that was a different story. Couldn't resist the dig. So, you know, it's interesting when, what was it, Malcolm who said, when those chickens come home to roost, when what occurred over, and here's what's even more bizarre, you know, raising the alarm system because of the danger to be imported or to arrive from seashores or shores across the sea, when the danger is here, when the danger are people running around who believe that it is them against everyone else and are willing to sacrifice, forget about willing to sacrifice, they're willing to take everyone with them.
I don't know how many times on social media I see a Canadian say, yeah, build a wall. Y'all stay behind it, you know? But that's the perceptions within and without. That being said, my little timer here says we got a little more than 2 minutes. What do you see for 2019? What do you want to see?
I predicted 2 years ago, and I haven't changed my mind. I don't think this president will finish the term. I think there will be a global deal that will basically protect his family and him. I think he will pack it in. Do I think that's going to make any fundamental changes in where the country's at in terms of structurally? No. But I do think it's going to be a wake-up call very much. I remember the way that Nixon was a wake-up call. I'm not concerned about Pence because he's going to be completely housebroken. I don't think there's going to be any revolutionary changes as a result of it. I suspect that there are discussions underway both within and without the White House and within and without law enforcement agencies. And, look, the cheerleaders for the Department of Justice, I know Mueller. I know Comey, that whole crew. I've fought them for decades. They're not good guys. They're not good women. It's very clear what the criminal justice system is about in this country. It's very clear what the Department of Justice is about. But it's also very clear that we don't give free passes to people because they're white and rich and powerful and male. I think the next 6 months are going to be very explosive on a lot of different levels. I think there are going to be a lot of desperate people who see things closing in around them. I think the pillage and plunder is going to accelerate even more so than we've seen so far. And I am cautiously optimistic that with the passage of or the passing of this regime, we'll have a period and hopefully we'll take a look and reflect and ask ourselves, how the hell did we end up here? And what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Well, I'm certainly in favor of that. I hope that big money lets it happen. Never a dull moment. But I thank you for taking time to be on the View Up Here episode for this year. And I guess we'll stay tuned.
Well, I want to thank you and thank your wonderful audience. And there are a lot of great folks out there that listen to you. And there are a lot of great folks doing some really good things. And up the rebels.
I was waiting for that. That was going to be my final words as well. That's it for the View Up Here in 2018. Much thanks to Stanley Cohen. Up the rebels. Happy New Year. Good night.
Happy New Year. Take care. Good night.